By the way, tonight we're going to continue on our series of conflicts as promised, conflicts of interest, that is, with what we call the revolving door in America, right? And tonight, correspondent Michele Greenstein is going to focus on the Wall Street bankers and their influence over the rest of us. And, you know, essentially, folks, this is a pretty simple story. This is the same story that we were told by our parents, etc. The fox and the hen house, right? The fox is guarding the hen house, and that causes problems. In this case, are Wall Street banks essentially
the foxes guarding the hen houses?
Yeah.
You could certainly say so. Some might even say that's an understatement. So let me take you through a few case studies, a few examples. I'll take you first to the Treasury Department, which is supposed to make sure we have a strong economy, right? An economy that works. But for whom? That's the question, right? So Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Trump's Treasury Secretary, guess where he was before he started working in the federal government? He was working at Goldman Sachs for 17 years, in fact. And before that, he actually founded One West Bank, which illegally foreclosed on people, and by the way, was never prosecuted for that. Now, speaking of Trump's economic team, we also have Gary Cohn, who was Trump's top economic advisor, recently left the White House, but not before saving Goldman Sachs $1 billion annually in tax cuts. Guess where he was before he was in the federal government? Goldman Sachs. So it's not just Trump, though, right? This is not a partisan thing. We also have Eric Holder, who is Obama's attorney general. Now, guess where he was before he was running the DOJ, right? He was actually at Covington Burling, which is a law firm that literally defends the big banks. And their client list has included Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo. So it's no surprise that Eric Holder failed to prosecute any bankers responsible for the collapse of the economy. In fact, he actually said that Wall Street banks were, quote, too big to prosecute. Guess where he is now?
Back in the same arena.
He's back at, actually, he's specifically back at Covington Burling.
That's why we call it a revolving door. They go from government to business to government to business to government to business.
That's exactly right. And by the way, guess who recommended Eric Holder to Obama, just as a side note? Michael Froman from Citigroup and John Podesta from Podesta Group. So it's a giant gaggle of bankers running the country. So that's who's supposed to be prosecuting these white-collar criminals on Wall Street, right? The DOJ. Now, who's supposed to be regulating the big banks? In theory, the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve is supposed to be regulating the big banks. So let me take you to Jerome Powell, who Trump appointed to be the chair of the Federal Reserve. Before he was the chair of the Federal Reserve, he was working for Carlyle Group, which is one of the largest private equity firms on earth, actually created by a Wall Street lawyer. And others who are currently on the board of governors at the Fed have positions at Brookings, they have positions at the Council on Foreign Relations, and both of these think tanks, have robust ties to Wall Street. But Rick, it actually goes beyond these current board members. And it actually goes even beyond the Fed's Board of Governors itself, because the Fed's Board of Governors is an agency of government. But you know what's not a government organization? The Federal Reserve. Despite the misleading use of the word federal, it's actually privately owned. It's not accountable to the United States government. And the legislation that created the Federal Reserve actually has these secret origins at this meeting on Jekyll Island. So let me tell you about that. We've got Nelson.
So these are, by the way, these are private individuals, then, right? Who then manifest their power back into the government. That's right. Back into this agency that's supposed to be regulating the big banks. But we're going to find out that they actually have ties to the bankers themselves. So a man named Nelson Aldrich, whose actually father-in-law was John D. Rockefeller, called this meeting of these financial interests. We had someone named Henry Davidson, partner at JP Morgan. We had someone named Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of what would become Citibank, who actually called this secret trip to Jekyll Island the conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. So the banking system in which we all live was drafted by these banks themselves. So here they are drafting the legislation that created the Federal Reserve Act, which makes it possible for bankers to regulate their own industry. It's absolutely insane. So the cake was baked a long time ago when they set up the Fed to be able to do this very thing that is, in essence, a conflict of interest. Exactly, being a so-called regulator, but in fact, many say that what the Fed actually does is benefits the investor class, benefits these banks themselves, these investment banks, at the expense of ordinary Americans. And even a former Fed official, Andrew Huszar, called what he did at the Fed, quote, the greatest backdoor Wall Street bailout of all time. Wow. So that's from someone on the inside. And not only that, Rick, I got to tell you this, the Fed also issues the nation's money. So that means that Wall Street is controlling the nation's money.
should that concern us?
So that's why when some of these people, like Bernie Sanders, say the system is rigged and we got to change it, I mean, in this sense, at least, this is not a commercial for Bernie Sanders, you know.
He's one of many, right?
But they're right. And,
right.
And by the way, it's not just at that level, because we always think, yeah, but at least we're protected down at the bottom, because we got guys working at the SEC whose job is to find if those scoundrels are doing these things and arrest them.
Right.
But those guys as well are part of the revolving door, because they want to work for the firms that they're regulating.
Right. I mean, this segment that you and I are doing right now is in no way an indictment of these individuals that exist in the system, or even these people at the top that we just ran through now. What we're talking about is a system that literally rewards corruption. And when a system allows banks to get so big that they can then go to the government and demand bailouts or on the threat of, you know, crashing the economy, that becomes a problem, right?
Yeah, it becomes a problem for anybody in America at the time who had a home and lost it in particular.
Right.
Yeah, and by the way,
that's just one of many industries in which we have bubbles like these.
Yeah, and it hurts, and it's a tough situation.
Right, and it all goes back to this, though. Why do we have this unelected, not a government body, controlling the money supply? Money is what everything is based on. We've got poverty, we've got war, we've got famine. All of these things are based on our money or our lack of money. And the fact that this unelected, non-government body is controlling it should, at the very least, be a cause for concern.
Great stuff. Great
Thanks
conversation. Important information.